federal compliance. I have to allow recording, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, and here we are at Cyburgh 2021. Glad to be here. My name is Labalme. I'm the CISO at CivicActions. We provide digital services that work for everyone. We mostly have federal clients. This is we also have a few state, local, and a few NGOs. I know this conference is mostly industry, but I think there's going to be some interesting overlap for what the feds are doing and what can be done in industry. I generally provide security compliance solutions, primarily with free and open source software. And I'm a pre-internet developer. When I got in the ARPANET in '75, there were no passwords. So cybersecurity has changed a bit since then. And I've lived in Pittsburgh for over 20 years, but I won't have any Steelers jokes. I'll be co-presenting with my colleague, Mary Lazzeri, the Director of Federal Strategy at CivicActions, and she will give a more detailed introduction when she takes over at the end of this talk, or near the end of this talk. As we all know, everybody in security, I speak acronyms. We will be talking about a few of them. I think ATO should be, many people may know that one, but it may be new also. And ATO, I'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's an authority to operate. There's also the system security plan required for an ATO, the risk management framework, which is from NIST. But I may have been out acronymed by NCI-JTF this morning. That might have done me. And what I learned when I became a CISO is that the S in CISO acronym stands for scapegoat. So they know where to go when something goes wrong. A little bit of history in 2002, when the internet was becoming more prominent and more government systems were going to the internet. Government realized cybersecurity was an important thing, and they passed the law FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management Act. That law mandated that federal systems must achieve a defined level of security compliance before they would receive an authority to operate, an authority to go online and let the system be available on the internet. The NIST published the risk management framework, initially 837, actually the whole 800 series of documents. All told, the 800 series plus the FIPS documents that go along with them add up to some 6,000 pages of dense cybersecurity compliance. And when you write your controls, you're really supposed to be aware of all of that. It's very, very difficult. And coming back to acronyms, and FISMA was updated in 2014 with FISMA, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. So I guess they ran out of acronyms. But anyway, with using the risk management framework, I created my first system security plan, which is the document you have to create in order to get an ATO. I wrote this in 2016 for a DoD client. It ended up being 400-page Word document, which is the form that they wanted it in. By page 10, DevOps had already turned page 1 into, made it obsolete. And I was very saddened by this. And I realized that, that checking checkboxes is not the way to get security. It's a good start. It's good to know what your checkboxes are. It's good to know that what you want is to build, what you want is, it gives you a good baseline of what you want. In fact, they call it a baseline. But you need to actually have a system that actually can manage and maintain the security of your system as it is in the moment. And so ever since then, I've been working on compliance automation. Just coming back to industry for a moment, there's a greater number of security controls. This has been mentioned in an earlier talk. The NIST controls for protecting controlled unclassified information. And the NIST special publication 800-171 defines this. There's a talk tomorrow. This basically provides the cybersecurity maturity model certification. There's a talk on this tomorrow. It's good to be prepared for this. Until now, contractors can provide the government with computer systems And the computer systems in the government have to be secure, but it's not necessarily clear that the government, that the contractor itself has to be secure. And so this is a really important point. And the CMC certification will be required by the Defense Industrial Base, but I've been talking to people in the Department of Education and Health and Human Services. It's just a system that makes sense. And if the contractor and supply chain isn't secure, you end up with things like SolarWinds problem or other problems because people aren't watching their back. If CMC is too deep to jump into to begin with, there's the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's really useful for C-level reporting. 50% of US organizations are already using this, and it's a great baseline. It protects not only against the nation state bad actors, but also can help protect you against industrial espionage. It's a really good start, and it's something that if you're wondering where to start, this is a good place to start. What we've been learning through all this process of working with these frameworks and trying to automate the system is that, as I mentioned, the 6,000 pages are filled with arcane language. They have non-intuitive groupings of controls. For compliance engineers, all these compliance frameworks suffer the same problem. They're complicated and difficult to understand. We want our system to be secure, and we need to automate this. And there are many tools and vendors here at Cyburgh that are working to help ensure system security, because managing and providing verification of compliance is, as we know, not trivial. So we see an opportunity to naturalize the process of highlighting the concept of, naturalize the process by highlighting the concept of reusable components. A component, what is a component? And a component is a grouping of partial or complete control implementation statements that deal with specific requirements of a defined technology or process. So basically, in easier words, a component could be like your log management system, or multi-factor authentication, or your disaster response and incident response systems, disaster recovery and incident response. So when you think about the system, when you're working on your log management system, your disaster recovery system, you know that that's going to involve authentication. It's going to involve log management. It's going to involve a number of configuration management, a number of controls. And if you could look at this on a macro scale of, I'm adding a log management system, what controls are affected by that, and look at it from that point of view, it makes making a system security plan much easier. So step one is to move away from Word documents and spreadsheets. The idea of automating compliance requires that we have machine readable SSPs. We have an ability to look at things at a component level. We could swap out, say, a component of Drupal as a content management system for WordPress, or Ilias for a learning management system for Moodle. And basically they have the same set of controls defined, but slightly modified for each particular system. So we built a proof of concept for this back a few years ago called this SSP Toolkit. This defines a few top-level components like Drupal, Ilias, AWS, SSH. And even though just a proof of concept, it has been useful to create this system security plans that have produced 5 ATOs for 4 different government agencies. And now we're looking at extending this, and we're working with the CMS, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, where they have a treasure trove of SSPs. We've got 300 SSPs to work with there. And what we're doing is we're using natural language processing techniques to discover and refactor these SSPs into known components. This is just a screenshot of where we're at. I don't have a link for this yet, but we will be open sourcing all of this information. Others are building user-friendly GRCs, like there's we're working with GovReady. They're building a really nice one. The MITRE security automation framework is really good for hardening and validating and monitoring systems once they're built. And as I mentioned, CMS has 5 or 6 projects going on at the same time, because with all their SSPs, they realize the importance of automating and making the system better. What we see is that a reusable component library will raise all boats, because all of these groups can do much better with a high-level contextual understanding of their systems. We can eliminate process redundancy through the creation of reusable shared resources and create a path for agencies to adopt compliance as code. We see a distributed compliance library as something that we're building one right now with CMS. We're building a federal shared library that they will be building. They'll probably have some parts of it which are private to CMS. That's wonderfully good. We think that vendors may want to, when they produce a web application firewall, if that could come along with a component library of controls that are specific to that web application firewall. We're also creating a new suite of free and open source tools for, as I mentioned, refactoring SSPs into known components, but also for component selection, filtered by criteria, and for composing multiple components and performing gap analysis. This is the most important point. Currently, it takes almost a year to generate an ATO at a cost of up to $1 million. Automating the process will cut the time down to 6 weeks and slash the cost to 1/10 of what it currently is. I think this is a game changer. ATO ASAP is something that can benefit federal agencies as well as the companies and organizations represented by everyone in this room. And with that, I'd like to turn over to my colleague, Mary Lazzeri.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. So again, my name is Mary Lazzeri, and I'm a former Obama White House technology advisor. So what is bureaucracy hacking? Well, I worked for a group called the U.S. Digital Service within the Obama White House, and I was what was known as a bureaucracy hacker. It's the term we came up with to describe sort of the art and somewhat science of removing well-meaning obstacles to progress. No one wants to think of themselves as an obstacle, but in government and in many large private sector organizations, like perhaps the ones you guys work for, even when everyone's performing their roles and just doing what they're supposed to do, it creates just natural points of friction that can lead to inertia. And I was part of a group of people who were empowered by the White House to release that inertia and remove some of those obstacles. And it was a pretty fun job. Next slide, please, Fen. So the status quo is not working, and Fen alluded to this earlier. The idea here is that there must be a reason why a federal agency or a state agency is releasing a new system or replacing an old one. They didn't just up and decide to dump out the apple cart. These things take time and money, so a lot went into the creation of the system in the first place. There must be some kind of policy change or mission need that is addressed by this new system. And in government, if the ATO process it takes longer than it needs to, then at least one of two things happens. Number one, a legacy system that may have security vulnerabilities stays out there in operation. I'm not a cybersecurity expert. I know that many of you are, but we only need to read the paper to understand that we're not able to fend off any of these intrusions. So even the most quote unquote secure systems are being hacked. And if we're leaving an older one out there in the wild, adds risk, as it's more likely to have major vulnerabilities. And while federal systems certainly aren't bulletproof, we know that, the state systems have been shown to be even more vulnerable and susceptible to this intrusion. Sometimes they carry even more PII, and they nearly always have less encryption. But in addition to this cybersecurity problem, there's a bureaucracy problem as well, because the longer this new system goes unlaunched, this government need that we were trying to address is not met. There's a reason we're putting that system out there in the first place. Maybe it's for the implementation of a new policy initiative. Maybe that's related to healthcare or Medicare or unemployment benefits. So this inertia that I talked about earlier that's caused by an overly burdensome ATO process sort of has these cascading negative effects. Next slide, please. One more slide, please, Ben. There we go. It's okay. No problem. So advocating for change. So what are we proposing? And Fen alluded to a lot of this earlier as well. We co-wrote a policy white paper for the Biden-Harris administration that proposes several key changes to existing processes or bureaucracy hacks, if you will. The first is the creation of a center of excellence within the General Services Administration, or GSA, to study, but we want them to do more than just study the problem. We want the task force to direct and implement technology pilots, like the one Ben was talking about, that will allow agencies or forward-leading agencies like CMS to experiment with compliance as code and OSCAL and more. And of course, you can't do any of this without funding. You know, compliance as code is by far not the most expensive thing the government's going to do, not by a long, long shot, but we can't expect it to happen without some funding. And we're proposing that that funding comes from the Technology Modernization Fund. Congress just beefed it up, and we're suggesting that OMB direct some of it to be used for these pilots, which when they're successful, will ultimately save the government millions over years, billions, in fact, over years. Then I have another couple of bureaucracy hacks in here. Appoint a single accountable leader. The keywords here are single and accountable. You can't expect leadership by committee to be successful, and you can't expect progress if you don't put some accountability standards in place. That accountability looks like measurable goals and milestones that are tracked by government oversight bodies. That's why we have those government oversight bodies like OMB and NIST and others. So let's use them for what they're good at. And finally here, public dashboards go a long, long way. Open government leads to progress. Next slide. Well, speaking of open governments, let's make it open. And Ben talked about this as well. So we're advocating strongly for this federal compliance library. There are a few reasons why. It'll lead to cross-agency collaboration, which we don't have now. We would be putting these pre-vetted vetted presets, templates, and the baselines for a lot of these common systems out there for sharing purposes. And as vendors, you should keep an eye on this. If we're successful in getting this library out there, that you may be able to look at ways that you can contribute to that shared library. This will allow us to leverage historical knowledge so that best practices can be allowed to have an impact beyond just one agency. And then finally, these common resources that we put out there for sharing would free up, agencies, compliance staff or cybersecurity professionals to focus on the authorization materials that require, more of a security focus or just more of that, unique documentation. And let's put as much out there as we can without a login. And let's provide tools for both the developer and non-developer. I'm not a developer, but I have a certain level of understanding of this. And in government, you're going to have people with a variety of skill sets, and all of whom have a stakeholder in the ATO process. So the more that we can demystify ATOs and the cybersecurity process in general, the more just people we can throw at the problem. And then the more secure ultimately will be. Next and last slide. And Fen mentioned this earlier. We have our pilot project at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. Fen talked a little bit about the natural language processing that we're doing. I'm just going to reiterate that here. We're running NLP across more than 200 SSPs at CMS. Basically, it works like this. As our tool and process finds SSP text that is similar up to a certain statistical confidence level, we flag that text as a likely matching component. And for example, think about the amount of time something like Splunk is used across an enterprise as extensive as the one they have at CMS. And now that we've done that analysis, we can review all the instances of this Splunk component narrative across the full corpus of SSPs, and then draft or identify or draft sort of the ideal version of that text, and then we can make updates across the board. So, essentially the process identifies what components are in these SSPs in the first place. Maybe it's that sounds obvious, but when you're dealing with hundreds of disparate Word docs, you might not actually know everything that's in there. And secondly, it provides a statistical confidence level that states the likelihood of a match. We do a gap analysis to show how the components that are meant to describe the same product or service or tech stack are similar or dissimilar. And the overall goal is to have the SSP reviewer who's preparing these ATOs to launch these systems, just give them a little head start on a lot of this easy, common stuff so that he or she can focus on the harder stuff that is unique and requires that security focus. We're hoping to open source these tools on GitHub soon. Ben mentioned that too. So please reach back out to us if you're interested in learning more. And that about sums up our presentation. But we are happy to take questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, if you have any questions, if you want to put them in the chat, or if you want to just unmute yourself, raise your hand. We can do that as well. Okay, so we do have one question in the chat regarding tech modernization. Is this related with CMMC efforts?
I don't believe tech modernization is directly related with CMMC. My understanding is that tech modernization, well, actually, Mary knows more about tech modernization. CMMC is a certification mechanism required by the defense, right now being required by for the defense industrial base, and probably for other federal agencies moving forward. I think the tech modernization fund, Mary, you can correct me if I'm wrong, may be employed to help implement and help people required contractors become certified, but that would be up to, that's a separate process.
Yep, it's related, but just in the whole big bubble of bureaucracy and cybersecurity. I mean, the CMMC is, of course, trying to improve the cybersecurity posture of agencies and federal contractors, and then the ATO process is meant to sort of certify that individual systems are secure. So yeah, it's definitely just components of a greater whole.
Great. And we have a question from Justin S. For students and young professionals, how do people get involved in this kind of work? So specifically improving government operations and the efficient and effective use of IT resources.
That's a great question. I'm happy to answer it. So we're really trying, the government is really trying to lower the barrier of entry to the federal government. If you go to usajobs.gov, it's a pretty lengthy process to apply for a federal job, and we need it to be faster and easier. So OMB and OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, are really trying to make it easier for young people interested to apply. You also may want to Google the U.S. Digital Service, or USDS. That's a great way to get into government if you're a tech professional who maybe isn't looking to have a career-long term in government. We really want to bring in people with fresh tech minds and skill sets into government, and so the USDS is a great place to start.
Great. Ty Prince has a question, so I'm going to add him into the spotlight so he can ask that personally.
Yes, I work for Databank. We're actually one of the 6 FedRAMP cloud service providers, so we're very familiar with the NIST guidelines and some of the data center requirements. One of my questions was, how are you guys tackling some of the, I would say, very diverse data centers and help out with their cloud smart strategy? I work with Thomas from GSA, who runs the Data Center Consolidation Initiative across the federal government. As you know, they have over thousands of data center sites and obviously trying to build a cloud-first strategy. How are you guys tackling compliance and security across all these different agencies and trying to bring them together to communicate, build a unified kind of data center cloud-first software initiative?
That's a really good question, and we're skirting that right now. We're basically we're for our pilot project, we're narrowing the field, and CMS is moving a large part of their systems to AWS, and so we're looking at just AWS as we're just looking at AWS right now. We do have Azure and Google Cloud also on our horizon. We're looking at it because we want to make sure we don't do anything that locks us into AWS. So we're primarily focused on AWS. We're primarily focused on a relatively small number of systems right now. There's over 6,000 ATOs across the federal government, at least. That's by a simple counting. And we're looking at, we're very happy to be able to have access to 200 of them at CMS right now. Previously, we've had access to 4. And so and the ones we've been working on so far are, as I said, all based on AWS. So that's the data center we're looking at.
What a follow-up question off of that. I've at least seen some, including with like the DCCO initiative through DHS for a hybrid cloud and kind of that entire dynamic environment. How would you guys tackle that? Would you guys work across with multiple different vendors? How is the ecosystem on cybersecurity?
Our hope, and Mary might have some input to this too. Our hope is to start building a library with, we think there's probably going to be somewhere between 50 and 200 components in it to begin with, for managing things like, Splunk and backup systems and various other things. Once that library is out there and people see it, once we have the first 30 or 40 out there, hopefully, hopefully people will start to see that this is useful. The SSP toolkit is, as far as I know, one of the only published SSPs out there, because people don't publish their SSPs, and so that's sort of an open source SSP that anybody can look at and say, hey, gee, how do I implement AU3? And what the AU3 implementation, the SSP toolkit, should not be copied and used right as it is, but at least it gives you an idea of one way of doing it. And what we hope to do is create a community in a way that people can contribute to it, so that when the government or when anyone wants to build a new system, one of the things that they might do is they might say, gee, we want to make sure the system's compliant. We'll use tools for which there are components available. And because then we'll know that then it's easier for us to manage compliance. And also those components have built into them back-end testing and verification systems. And so, things like inspect tests or whatever might be attached to the back end. So it will be very, we hope that it'll become very exciting for new vendors to produce their own, to add to the library of components. And they can do it in their, we're building a library to be distributed so that they could add to a shared federal library, they could add to a library on GitHub, they could add to a library that they share just to their clients.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. Sorry, no, I'm sorry. To address sort of the data center consolidation, it's like, I think Ben did a pretty good job of explaining how it's loosely related, but like the automation of these ATO processes will speed the delivery of software in government in general, which I think would like, in that process would allow us to consolidate more data centers and move more to the cloud. So I think it is related, and I think it all sort of raising tide raises all boats kind of thing.
Great, thank you. And we have time for one more question. Who, meaning what organizations, who's accepting these automated SSP today?
Almost no one. As I mentioned, I've gotten 5 ATOs through the SSP toolkit process. I have not gotten a single assessor to even look at a GitHub repository. They all want them printed out in Word or whatever, and so there's processes in the SSP toolkit for printing out this stuff in Word. This is one of the exciting reasons why we're working with CMS. CMS is realizing they need to automate the process, and so we have not yet produced an automated SSP for them, but that's what they want us to do. And so right. CMS would be the first answer.
Well, and it is my sort of intention, once we have a bit of more of this component library that we're just going to put out there through our pilot project at CMS, to approach OMB and some of my former contacts there and see if we can sort of scale it so that more agencies do accept these sort of vetted presets, and we get sort of more light and more attention to the concept of a federal compliance library.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you both so much. Really appreciate it. Yeah, that's all the time that we have. It's noon. We will be back tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So thank you. Thanks to everyone for attending today, and we'll see you early tomorrow.
Thank you.
Everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.